of the Montgomery Cup Series this year. We are extremely excited to be here. Dundee is one of the sweetest unions that we
Yeah.
come to. They're always so hospitable, and we just always have such a fantastic time while we're here. And tonight we are going to be debating the resolution this House, as the United States, would seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China. So, a little bit of a different type of resolution than those we've debated thus far on the tour. Should be a pretty interesting debate, really looking at the geopolitical climate
Right.
as opposed to honing in on things that are happening, with our elections and
Mhm.
with our president. So, very, very interesting debate is what we are anticipating tonight. Do you have anything to add to that, Jack?
I just think it'll be interesting to see how the Scottish debaters, although one of them is from America,
Mm-hmm.
um, be interesting to see how they view, because the resolution is from the perspective of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how the Scottish adopt a perspective that's, not theirs,
Right, right.
just to see how things work out. But it should be quite interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we do want to let you all know that on the live feed on YouTube, the chat and comment section is enabled. And so if you have any questions about what you're seeing, what you're viewing, please feel free to post questions there, and we will do our best to answer them through our broadcast. And I know some of the times some jargon pops up, like we say this house, automatically assuming that people understand that
Yeah.
we know what that means.
Or
And
speaker positions, that
right,
kind of thing.
speaker
Yeah.
position, that sort of thing. Just some of the jargon and lingo. We'll try to discuss that a little bit more tonight. As we get ready for tonight's debate, I do want to let you know that the teams of Abby Upshaw and Ryan Hill and Manny Reyes and Bobby Gums, so our U.S. teams from Central Missouri, will be filling the prime minister position and then also opening opposition. So, like I said a few debates ago, we often debate the corners. So that means the Scottish team from Dundee, they will fill the opposition, the leader of the opposition, and also or closing government. So that's what you have to look forward to. We are extremely excited, and we will be popping in and out throughout the debate, as you've gotten used to let you know what's going on and answer any questions that you might have. So now we're going to turn it over into the chamber to see if the debate is ready to get started.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's debate for the Montgomery Cup. The motion is this House, as the United States, would seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China. First, of course, we are going to be running gender pronoun policy, so if you could each, in order of speaker, please tell us your name, your position, and your preferred pronouns, beginning with the Prime Minister.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm the Prime Minister, and I like to be referred to as she or her.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Oh, okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Joanna. She or they, please. I am the leader of the opposition.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm the Deputy Prime Minister, and I go by she, her pronouns.
Hi, I'm Rory. I'm Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and my preferred pronouns are he or they.
Hi, I'm James. I'm the member of the government. My preferred pronouns are he or they, please.
My name is Manny. I am the member of opposition, and my preferred pronouns are he, him.
Hi, my name is Tara. I am the government rep, and my pronouns are she or they, please.
And I'm Bobby. I'm the opposition whip, and my pronouns are she or they.
Okay, thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister up to open the case for side proposition. Here, here.
Great, so before I get started, I just want to extend a quick round of thank yous. This has been absolutely lovely getting to know you guys so far. I'm very excited for this debate, and I hope that we can make it very educational. A quick roadmap just to kind of explain to you guys of where I'll be going. First, I'll be going over some definitions and then two substantive points of matter, whereas my partner will be taking over a third. So, in terms of the resolution, this House, as the United States, would seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China. We are going to define this House as the United States and its constituents. We will then define accommodation as something supplied for convenience or to satisfy a need, such as lodging. For the purpose of this debate, we'll look at our definition of accommodation through the lens that the United States and its constituents should need to make a mass exodus to either China or Russia. And through our 3 points, we will show you why Russia is the more favorable of the two. Now, keep this in mind. As the government side, we are not advocating that these countries are necessarily good or bad, but we have to look at which one is the better, as stated by the res. We will now move on to our first 2 points of substantive matter, and as I explained before, my partner will present a third in her speech. First, logistically, Russia is the best choice for this move in terms of population and physical size. If we needed to leave the United States and move to a foreign country, we would need as much habitable land as possible to allow ourselves room to settle and actually start our lives over. Russia is about 17 million square kilometers with a population of about 146 million. China, on the other hand, is only 9.5 million square kilometers with a population of 1.3, I'll get you at the bottom of this, 1.3 billion people. China also has serious sanitation issues due to the overwhelming population and the lack of space to escape the spreading of diseases. Russia's size logically solves this. Your question?
Yes, why is your interpretation of accommodate the best way to have an educational debate?
Okay, so my partner and I, we don't want to just have a simple debate of China bad, Russia bad. We want a more educational debate, so we're choosing to look at why lodging in Russia is better than China for a more educational debate, and my partner can expand upon this in her next speech. All right, the United States is 9.8 million square kilometers with a population of 321.4 million people. It's clear that looking through size and population, if a move from the US was necessary, moving to Russia would obviously be better than China because of China's small size and huge population, whereas Russia is so much larger than China and they have a smaller population. Logically, it would be so much easier for the United States to start over with a brand new life within Russia versus China. Second, our substantive point of matter will be on human rights, specifically the human rights abuses that are currently taking place in China and are not getting any better. China's justice system is plagued by unfair trials, torture, and other ill treatment in detention centers. For example, China classified information on its extensive and unnecessary use of the death penalty as a state secret. This is something that we cannot stand behind and we do not want to be a part of, which is why we are seeking accommodation within Russia instead of China. Furthermore, Chinese government and authorities subjected predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in Xinjiang to intrusive surveillance, arbitrary detention, and forced indoctrination. Furthermore, many Buddhist and Taoist temples and statues, along with mosques and churches, were damaged or destroyed by the direction of the Chinese government in 2019. This is something that we cannot stand behind, and we don't want to be a part of an institution that does this, which is, again, why we are seeking accommodation with Russia over China, specifically because of the human rights abuses of the Chinese government towards specific religions within China. Moving on to our second point within our second substantive point of matter. The LGBT plus community and feminist activists are discriminated against and detained. The LGBTQ plus community forces widespread discrimination and stigma within the Chinese society. In 2019, due to inadequate medical services, the LGBT plus community took serious risks by seeking unregulated gender-affirming treatments. The LGBT plus community also faced abuse in the form of conversion therapy. China is obviously way behind in the times in terms of surgery and therapy for the LGBT plus community, and this is something that we cannot stand behind. We want to be accommodated within a country that is also going to be accommodating for people of all. Yes, your question.
If my understanding of your definition is correct, you still go with the definition of the United States, not the United States population. So would there be an accommodation for US government and a state infrastructure within these states if we're accommodating to the United States as a whole?
So we defined this house as United States constituents, so the population. So we're not necessarily stating that we would be starting a completely brand new government over in Russia. This is just us saying if we have a mass exodus and we must leave the United States, that we would move to Russia. That's kind of another debate that we can have if you would like. So if you want to bring that up, feel free. But we are not advocating that we start off a new government. Moving on, in 2015, going down our LGBT plus community and feminist activist point, in 2015, a group of feminist activists were wrongly detained as they prepared to hand out leaflets and stickers about domestic violence within China. 5 of the women that were detained were held for over a month. This is something that happens within China. This is furthering the point that they are so far behind on the times in terms of actually accepting feminist activists and feminist points of view. We cannot allow this to go on, and we cannot stand in support of China. So that is why, again, moving to Russia would be the better choice, because again, they're going to be accommodating to all people, all women. It doesn't matter what your sexuality is or what your gender is. Like, they're going to be more accommodating to you than what China could be. So, what have I told you today? Today, I have explained that logistically, Russia is the best choice, specifically in terms of population and physical size. China is overpopulated, it's crowded, they're running rampant with disease, and this is something that we can avoid by moving to Russia. Furthermore, the human rights abuses in China are not something that we want to participate in. We want to go to Russia, that way everyone can be accepted. And you might look at this debate and ask, like, why should we engage at all? Because as I stated in the beginning of my argument, like, we're not advocating that all of these countries are great, that Russia is absolutely perfect, but the US cannot be isolationist. This would be horrible for our economy. Our governments are intertwined with so many other nations globally, so we need to be intertwined with Russia, specifically because they are better than China. And with that, I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, thanks to the Prime Minister for that fine speech. And now invite the Leader of the Opposition up to begin the case for the side opposition.
Okay, so I am going to bring you sort of 2 main points of substantive today, and that's going to be like the backlash of diplomacies between Russia and the US break down, and why maintaining good relationships with China is really important. I understand this is not entirely the debate that the Prime Minister has set up, so I'm going to sort of engage with a bit of what we said, because we prepped for accommodation to mean like, you know, diplomacies and improving relations. I think that is kind of the intention of what the motion was to be. But I'm just going to engage with a bit of what you said anyway. So your first point was all about the logistics of going to Russia in opposition to China. Well, what we have to bear in mind is that the economy in Russia is actually not very good at the moment. Like, they do not have an economy that can withstand having that many people enter their country. Like, they don't have the finances for it. They don't have like the infrastructure to accommodate it. And your second point was about human rights issues. Obviously, the human rights issues in China are very problematic, and will completely concede that. However, you can't actively condemn like the Chinese human rights issues, particularly of the LGBTQ plus community, and then stand by what Russia are doing in Chechnya. Like, human rights abuses are occurring in both Russia and China. It cannot be your argument as to not go to China, because human rights abuses in Russia are appalling at the moment, and you cannot stand behind that on your side of the house either. That just, yeah, it's completely not fair. So anyway, I'm going to sort of bring this back to the debate that we sort of were intending on our side of the house anyway to have. And that's basically like, why would the US seek accommodation in terms of like diplomacies, in terms of like examples might include things like lifting sanctions, not engaging in proxy wars, not like blocking treaties, that kind of thing, as opposed to going to live there, because I don't think that really works on either side of the house. So, under the motion, the US is like seeking accommodation with Russia. Nothing about the motion suggests that there is going to actually be an achievement of the goals set out with them by improving the relationships with Russia. And additionally, there's nothing about the motion that suggests that they are even going to achieve accommodation with Russia. It's just that they are going to seek accommodation with Russia. Moreover, nothing in this motion actually suggests permanence of this like accommodation, and I think that's something that's really important. International relations between countries is forever changing. Like, Russia and US is actually a very good example of this. Russia and China are additionally a very good example of this. Like, literally within 3 years, the US's relationship to China has gone from, like, quite good to terrible and engaging in a trade war again to, like, starting to improve diplomacies again. So there's such a massive, like, fluidity in the nature of international relations that I think trying to seek accommodation with Russia, there is no way to suggest any permanence in this whatsoever.
On this.
No, thank you. Even 50 years ago, the relationship between the US and Russia was like very, very tense. This is sort of going to go into the sort of picture I'm going to paint when things completely fall down. So, like, relations are getting slightly better right now, but things are very, very fragile at the moment. Like, all it takes is a change in leadership, like the new US election, or like a perceived threat from either end for the relationship between the US and Russia to completely break down.
Joe.
Yes, sure.
Okay, sure. It's true that when the U.S. has a bad relationship with a country, the relationship's internal, right? But let's look at the relationship between, like, the U.S. and Germany, or the U.S. and the United Kingdom. Once a good relationship is established, it cannot fail because diplomatic relations become solidified over time.
Well, I think, like, for a start, this motion isn't about whether we will completely achieve diplomatic relationships. It's whether we're going to, like, seek them in the first place. And one, this is going to start pissing off China because your goal, as presumably in this motion, is to start squashing China and become like a global power. Like, it's an actor motion, so we want the US to do well in this. Secondly, like, the US and Russia have had such fragile relations for such a long time that it's not suddenly overnight going to become the same relationship that the US has to countries like Germany. Like, you can't just sort of snap your finger and all of a sudden they're best buddies. That's not really how it works. And because of this, because it is, like, so fragile at the moment, like, the US and Russia have already been fighting a proxy war in Syria. Rory's going to talk to you a little bit more about this. There's, like, nothing to stop this now from going into a full-blown war, because you've just sought accommodation with Russia, then completely left them when all of your goals have been completely gone. Like, yeah, there's nothing to stop it from becoming like a full-blown war. And this is going to be, like, inherently really dangerous to, like, both sides here, but particularly the US. And even if the US was to achieve its goal in sort of seeking power or whatever it is, then there's going to be, like, absolutely no permanence in this, and it means that Russia can just be sort of tossed aside, which means that the relationships would completely break down and a war is more likely to occur. So in the best case scenario, there's, like, imminent threat of war, tensions are very high, diplomatic relations are really bad. Worst case scenario, there's war, like, military spending is massive, like, it costs too much money, there's huge loss of life, like, global powers is also really halted because you're engaging in, like, you're engaging all of your time in relations with Russia specifically, and this is really detrimental. Additionally, though, this is going to have, like, this motion can have a massive backlash between Chinese relationships, and one of the main aims of the US as a state actor is to protect US corporations. And, like, one of the major barriers at the moment is the US-China trade war. This is something that they have now entered negotiations into to actually improve. However, what you are going to do in this case is now say, we're actually deliberately trying to oppose China, that's what it says in the motion, therefore hindering any progression in the relationship. So this means things like the US-China trade war can increase. This has been costing billions of dollars on either side due to trade tariffs. And again, like, this relation is, like, getting better currently, but you're about to make it much worse again because you're directly opposing them. So for all these reasons, oppose.
And that was Joanna Ionette from Dundee's Debating Society, opening up the leader of the opposition case. We'll now turn it over to Ryan Hill from the University of Central Missouri, who will be rebuilding the Prime Minister's case as she is serving as the Deputy Prime Minister in tonight's debate.
For this debate, this really educational debate. Without further ado, I'll get along down to my case. So first we'll look at resolutional analysis, specifically under that of accommodation. When we're looking at accommodation, let's think what you think of when you first hear the word accommodation. you probably think of a hotel or a hostel, somewhere where you can stay. And as we've defined accommodation, something supplied for convenience or to satisfy a need, such as lodging. When we look at our definition of accommodation, we can look at both diplomatic ties and literal accommodation in both of it. We're looking for more educational debate. Otherwise, it's just going to be two teams saying, here's why China's bad and we shouldn't look at China, or here's why Russia's bad and we shouldn't look at Russia. This lets us look at a more vast reason of things to look at as to seek accommodation. We're looking at diplomacy and logistically and realistically. Without further ado, let's get down on the case. Let's begin with a little bit of rebuttal. So under my opponent's case, the argument on our first point was that the economy in Russia is not very good. I have a couple of responses to this. First of all, the United States has the biggest economy in the world. We are the strongest economy in the world. Even if Russia's is weak, we're still the actors in this situation. Second of all, the economy in China relies directly on the United States. The United States is the biggest player here. Moving on to our second point on human rights issues. They talked about how there's human rights abuses in both China and Russia. This is true. Human rights abuses exist in almost every other nation. Let's specifically look at terrorism. With Russian terrorism, Russia has been at least attempting to prevent terrorism, for example, fighting ISIS in Syria. China, on the other hand, has been actively supporting terrorism in Taiwan. When we look at human rights abuses, they'll exist no matter what, but we've extended and we've shown exactly how the problem of human rights abuses exists in China and why the United States should not seek accommodation in China for these reasons. Let's move on to their case. They looked at the point of why would the United States seek accommodation for diplomacy. As I said, with our definition of accommodation, we'll look at both diplomacy and logistically. Moving on to the point of improving relationships. They mentioned there's no way to suggest permanence. We're just seeking accommodation. We're not permanent, we'll stay there, we'll get any of the benefits. I don't see how this is unique to either side. The resolution is the resolution. If they're going to say it's not permanent, we won't get any benefits from Russia, we wouldn't get any benefits from China, and we're back at the beginning of the resolution. Let's have some actual clash in the debate. They talked about how relations between China and Russia are very fragile right now. We'll show you why this is good following in my third main point. They mentioned that by seeking accommodation with Russia, this would upset China. Otherwise, if we were to seek accommodation with China, this would make Russia mad. As they showed, the United States and Russia's relationship is already fragile, and they expanded this out to a full-blown war. This is the reason why we should seek accommodation in Russia, because Russia and the United States have 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world. I'll explain further on this in my point. Moving on to the point of backlash in the United States/China trade war. Again, we talked about keeping diplomacy in our definition. We're arguing diplomacy and logistically. We wanted to have a more well-rounded and a more educational debate. I'll move on to our third substantive point. That's nuclear tensions in Russia. Currently, China and the United States have mutual political, economic, and security interests, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Trump administration said that they would no longer consider itself bound by the INF Treaty's provisions. This raised nuclear tensions between the United States and Russia. Most, in fact 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are owned by Russia and the United States. The United States should attempt to make the Russians a more integrated partner and treat Russia as a potential ally in order to lower these tensions. While China, Russia, and the US are all attempting to proliferate nuclear weapons, the United States and China have good relations on the matter, while the United States and Russia do not. This tense relationship is more dangerous given that the United States and Russia also have the most amount of nuclear weapons. By choosing to seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China, we work toward not only lowering tensions, but more so rebuilding our relationship with Russia as a potential ally. With this new relationship, the United States is also working to avoid a possible nuclear war. This could lead to mass extinction, which would not be good for anyone. When we're looking at our points today, there are arguments on accommodation specifically, as my partner said I would expand on. When we're looking at accommodation, we're looking at multiple forms of the word. We're not looking at accommodation just in lodging, and we're not looking at accommodation in just diplomacy. We're looking at it in a full, well-rounded view of it. We're trying to have an educational debate here where we can talk about multiple things, not just why one country is bad or why one country is good. We're looking at a well-rounded form of the debate. I'll take your question.
How does seeking accommodations actually stop Russia from nuking the United States in the future instead of the two leaders just having a contest about it?
When we're looking at that, when we're looking at seeking with Russia or China, if we're looking at nuclear weapons, it could really be considered the better of two evils, for example. When we look at seeking with Russia, because Russia and the United States have 90% of the nuclear weapons, when we're looking at China, China and the United States already have good relations when we're talking about nuclear weapons, while China and Russia don't. We need to look at Russia as an ally and treat them as a valid country so that we can lower the tense relationship and have better options of not going into a nuclear war. So what have we learned today? We've covered the logistics. Logically, Russia is the best option for the US to literally seek accommodation in terms of population and size. If there were a mass exodus, for example, if the United States would become non-habitable for whatever reason, Russia is the better option of the two to literally seek accommodation. When we're looking at our second case on human rights abuses, we showed you China's justice system and its attacks on religion. We showed you the harms in China to the LGBT plus community. And we looked at the attacks on women and on other religions in China. This shows that China is discriminatory to women and the LGBT plus community, as well as behind on the terms of medical service and jailing as a whole. When we look at our third point, that of nuclear tensions in Russia, we looked at how Russia and China, when we're looking at accommodation, seeking diplomatic accommodation with Russia is preferable when compared to China because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and because of the tensions between Russia and the United States versus the United States and China. When we're looking at this today, this could lead to a nuclear war. And when we're looking at seeking accommodation with Russia in opposition to China, we're looking at preventing that nuclear war. And with that, I concede the rest of my time.
And that was Central Missouri's Ryan Hill, serving as the Deputy Prime Minister for tonight's debate over the resolution this House, as the United States would seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China. We will now turn it over to Rory Bannerman, who is the member of the opposition, who will forward the opposition case.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank all of our guests for coming all the way over here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be engaging with so many new faces from so far afield. I think I'll give you a rundown of my sort of the three main points I'm going to get to after I've dealt with some of the interesting concepts that need rebutting, I think. So first of all, I'm going to just expand a little bit on what Joe's talked about regarding how this upset to the status quo is really not preferable to the current situation and current international power balance in terms of the US's national interest. I'm going to then talk about how this disrupts global markets in a way that just is not for the US's benefit. And then I'm going to finish with a fun case about why we want as many proxy wars as we can possibly fit in. First of all, just to deal with the first definition of accommodation, I think it's interesting that we've taken the debate in an unexpected direction. I think fundamentally the one principle that kind of undermines a lot of what we've heard from side government is the idea that we'd be having a much more pleasant experience in Russia than we are in China. Because if you want proper statistical data on this, I'm pretty sure in like the global rankings of democracy and authoritarianism, China and Russia are pretty much on a par. They're pretty much as oppressive and human rights abusing as each other. You just have to find a specific incidents of all there. Both sort of lots of minority discrimination and racism and clamping down on personal freedom across the board. But if we're going to choose one, I don't think that the Siberian healthcare infrastructure is really going to be suiting us as compared to the nation that built a hospital within a matter of weeks. If that's what you really wanted to choose. I'm also kind of confused about the strength of the US economy versus what's going on in Russia and China. I'm not. Are we going to kind of supplant Apple and Walmart and everything, and that's just going to keep on running in Kamchatka as if it was Silicon Valley? But anyway, onto the main case. So yeah, as Joe described, what we're running here is the idea that under the status quo, the US is in a much stronger position than would be if we tried to upset things internationally. I think it's in Catch-22, this quote comes from my thing. Rome was destroyed, Greece was destroyed, Spain was destroyed. All great countries are destroyed. How much longer do you think your own country will last? I mean, the status quo internationally is not a permanent fixture, and we should be very careful when we're trying to kind of unpick it. Because fundamentally, the reason why we can deal with the Russian government and the Russian state in its current or the setup of Russia in its current form is based on a hostility to America that is pretty much has been entrenched
for decades, and needs sort of careful sort of management from within if we're going to be best of friends as soon as we arrive. I mean, they've been bred to hate Americans for decades, and so I don't think that would be a pleasant start to things. But in terms of what, I'll get you in a second, James. I think, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. I'll come back. Never mind. Why does why would allying with Russia in this way disrupt the global markets? Well, it's because we would always be seeking a power balance internationally. Smaller states have a decision if they want to accept American influence or if they want to accept Chinese influence in the forms of how the government carries out its tasks, which contracts that they endorse for either Chinese or American firms that wish to develop in their country, be that in Africa or Southeast Asia or anywhere. And if there is a situation in which Russia allies with the United States, improving the United States' global position, well, they're not going to react well to that, and then Chinese influence is not going to be halted, because the natural, the historical consequence is that the power balances are sought.
Right,
in a minute, James. I can see where you're going. And so to upset the global current bipolar order would risk market disruption and kind of upset the power balance. Why not?
At the point at which Russia is not a democracy, why does it matter what the Russian people as actors think? If Putin gets good things out of this deal, he will go for the deal. It's a transactional regime.
Because I care about Putin and him remaining in power. I don't think that it's going to be a good sell to the Russian people with his treaty with America, because his whole power base is based on reaction to perceived American imperialism. But I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get to the fun part. So the USA needs proxy wars, okay? Because the biggest strength that the United States has is its military, which completely dominates the globe. Now, part of this, now one of the reasons for this is because it has the ability to practice, to have a lot of proxy wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, to ensure that its army and navy are up to fighting strength, that their military technologies have a good kind of test ground or real grounds to sort of to practice, and as well as that, to ensure that the military-industrial complex is running lovely and healthy. And as the US, that's being one of our most important sectors and a linchpin of our economy that we wish to support, we think it's entirely within our interests to allow them to continue manufacturing the kind of weaponry that is required from these conflicts. And if we are going to seek accommodation with Russia, then I'm sorry, but the Syrian conflict will be at an end. The Eastern Ukrainian crisis will be at an end, and then there'll be no one nowhere to practice using our assault weaponry and airstrikes and so on, which would be devastating to the US's economy and its military reputation, thereby making the US appear less threatening, weaker overall, and risking further conflict. So for all those reasons, I beg you to propose. Thank you very much.
And that was Rory Bannerman closing off the top half of the debate for side opposition, also showcasing some of that fantastic wit and humor that we love in BP debate. So now we're going to turn it to the bottom half of the debate, and the leader of closing government, James Ford, will advance the Prime Minister and side government case.
On the military-industrial complex, I'm then going to extend on Eastern Europe. First, a bit of to the opening, right, all right, there are customary rules of debating, right? There is no codified BP rule set somewhere. The rules are purely driven by custom. If we don't respect the customs, there's no way it can prepare for the debate. There is a custom that you cannot squirrel, i.e. you cannot have a interpretation of the motion which is not within the plain meaning of the debate. Any British debater knows this, therefore their case falls outside. Second, even if you do accept their case, they never tell us what the scenario is, right, which is actually crucial to how it works. What if the scenario is that the US and Russia have fought a nuclear war and they're both wastelands? In that scenario, scenario, then we should go to China because, like, you know, there are crops there and things. So they fundamentally haven't met their burden, even if you accept their framing. Okay, on to my case. I'm going to clash directly with Rory. Oh yeah, first briefly on Joe. Joe says this thing of, oh, we're only seeking accommodations. We don't know if we'll get them. Well, yeah, but we certainly won't get them if we don't seek them. Like, you know, I think that's a fair point. Okay, the mechanism, right? The proper mechanism for this debate. Yeah, Joe's right. We are seeking accommodations, right? But there is a process of seeking which happens before we seek them, right? There are preliminary talks about talking which we will conduct with Russia, the State Department and the Russian Federation, right? Like, why is this good? One, it's good because it's an incentive in and of itself. The legitimacy of talking to the United States is a carrot, notwithstanding what the accommodations will be. And so we don't actually have to, like, reach accommodations necessarily in order to be solvent on our side. More on this later. But then also it's good because this is going to be a process between the State Department and Russia. At the point in which America is more powerful than Russia, it has a greater military than Russia, and the State Department is better funded than what, I don't know what Russia has, whatever they have. Like, the accommodations are naturally going to be more weighted towards the United States than they are towards Russia, right? Just like, by the way, diplomacy works. If we have a better bargaining position, we will get accommodations which favor ourselves. Okay, so first on to what should have been the OG case, right? So what does the United States want as an actor? It wants three things, right? One, it wants entrance to markets that can sell all of its crap. Two, it wants control of material resources that can inflate the prices of its crap. Three, it wants control of international political legitimacies that can overthrow regimes that don't allow it to do the first two things, right? Okay, what is happening in China, right? China has more people than the United States. China's economy is almost larger than the United States. China's economy is growing faster than the United States. China will overtake the United States. Not militarily for a long time, more on this later, but in terms of its economy, right? What does this mean? It means that China can control governments through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It means that China can not only continue to deny U.S. access to its own markets, but it can expand this denial to Africa, to Italy, to the European Union, to the rest of the world. It means that they can control the oil in the South China Sea, thus meaning that the U.S. can artificially lower the price so as to sell shale and make their economy runnable, briefly.
Are you aware of the fact that China's economy is at the lowest growth rate?
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, like, fine, it is. It'll rebound. They still have more people. They still have more. Well, okay, so, like, very briefly, we live in a credit economy, right? Like, the fact of the matter is that the U.S.'s economic power isn't real. It doesn't have machinery that produces things. It controls the world through financial capital. China has machines that produce things. If you want to build a military, you know what's more helpful? Machines that produce things. Like, inevitably, this will rebalance insofar as the economy which the U.S. uses to maintain itself is real. Okay, let's contrast Russia as an actor. Russia is a middle-income country, right? Russia has a big military. Russia has nuclear weapons. It is not an economic threat to the United States. The U.S. is a country which is driven by its economy. It doesn't really want territorial acquisition, right? It wants the things that we've laid out, right? So the antagonism that we have with Russia is politically useful, and I'll get on to this, but it's not a real antagonism of interest, right? Whereas inevitably China will be. Okay, so what does Russia want as an actor, right? We think fundamentally that Russia is an opportunistic country with an opportunistic foreign policy. Like, Vladimir Putin wants to have big parades in places in the Middle East that he can show his people, look, I'm really great, like, please don't overthrow me, right? Like he wants warm water ports in the Middle East that he can, like, spread his military further out. He wants to solidify his control of, like, the extent to which Russia already has a colonial empire in Syria or whatever, right? These things are fundamentally not contrary to the interests of the United States, except in a political sense, right? Like at the point at which the U.S. can just buy Syrian oil if we reach a deal with Russia, why do we care if Bashar al-Assad is in control of Syria in a geopolitical sense? This is a question that people don't ask, but it's absolutely true. In no way does this contradict what the U.S. wants to after. The reason why the U.S. rails against Russia is because it needs a boogeyman to justify the military industrial complex, as Rory tells you, right? Okay, but at the point at which this is true, we can just supplant the boogeyman to China through the corporate-controlled U.S. media, right, which brainwashes the populace. Like, why does it have to be the same boogeyman? You know? Okay, and so at the point at which Russia is not a democracy, it's totally opportunistic. It brainwashes its people as they tell you. Like, if we can say, Putin, hey, maybe we'll give you talks if you do this. Hey, Putin, like, maybe we'll, pull our special forces out of Syria if you do this. Like we can coerce Russia gradually into a foreign policy which benefits the United States. And once they are in this foreign policy which benefits the United States, diplomatic inertia means that it will be difficult for them to get out of it, right? Because the diplomats, like the U.S., they spread the pro-U.S. propaganda, we spread the pro-Russian propaganda, right? Like, our forces are, like, distributed in such a way that, we made a deal over the Middle East and we've shifted resources to the Navy in East Asia. Like, there's just an inertia that keeps this in place, right? So we think fundamentally at the point at which inevitably China will overtake the U.S., compromising its fundamental interests, at the point at which Russia does not have the capability to do this, at the point at which there are two classes of country in the world, those that already support the United States and those that don't, and the only important country in the world that does not support the United States is Russia. It is self-evident that we need to realign our interests. Okay, on to the military extension, right? Why is a war with China inevitable? Okay, so At the point at which they are overtaking these fundamental economic interests, right? What will America have in 2050 that China won't have once they have a larger economy, once they have more people, once they've stolen all of our IP, once they've denied us access to money? It will have 14 aircraft carriers. That's what it will have, okay? Do you know how long it takes to build the infrastructure to supply 14 aircraft carriers, to have oil to run 14 aircraft carriers, to have the roads to get the munitions from the factory to the 14 aircraft carriers? China cannot do this in 50 years, right? We will still have this advantage 50 years from now. What does this mean? It means that the capitalist-controlled government of the United States, which will feel threatened by China, will resort to war in order to restore its position. It will make up some incident, as it did in Vietnam, as it does when it overthrows South American governments, right? It will then send the Navy over to China. It will have it destroy the Chinese military-industrial complex and send them back to Stone Age to reassert its own power. At the point at which this war is inevitable, why is it better that we shift now? 3 reasons, 1 research, right? Okay, we're only getting land experience in the Middle East. We're not getting naval experience. We're not getting air experience against another air power, right? This means that we need to shift technology funding to what we will actually use in the naval and air war against China. The less land wars we have in the Middle East, the more easy it is to do. 2, placement of forces. If Russia is our ally, China will have to put a bunch of technology and troops on its northern border. They don't do this now. We can redeploy our forces, including aircraft carriers, whatever, to China. This means that the inevitable war does not last as long. This means it costs less money. This means that we can spend more on troops and so on and so on and so forth, increasing benefits. Finally, diplomacy. We think Russia will be like a good arbiter as a neutral power between these countries, and this will help to end the war. Briefly on Eastern Europe, they're really afraid of Russia. Like, clearly sanctions don't work, so we have no legitimate way to protect them. We need to ally with Russia in order to keep Eastern Europe loyal to us. Please vote for the proposition. Thank you.
And that was James Ford from Dundee, bringing up some really interesting and fun parts about BP debate, bringing in the element of squirreling the resolution that came out of the Prime Minister's speech, and then also doing what's called knifing the Prime Minister and going in their own direction. We'll come back to that in our commentary afterwards, but this is turning out to be a really fantastic and interesting debate. So now we are going to turn it over to Manny Reyes from UCM, who will open the bottom half of the opposition debate.
It's a very educational debate. Let's keep it going. So first, I want to give a quick summary of the top half, and then I have a few responses to the member of government speech before offering 2 main substantive points of argumentation. First, a quick summary of the first half. The first half is basically summarized as the PM gives us a very educational and a different way to look at this type of resolution. We see that the opening opposition did a good job of explaining why this would not be a good idea, and they also offer some practical issues with not only the PM's idea, but also why we shouldn't seek accommodation of Russia over China. However, we see that the member of government comes up and talks about how we should seek accommodation with Russia over China, and they give a lot of broad assertions, but they don't really back a lot of these ideas up with facts, and they don't really explain how. I'll first go into some rebuttal and just basically answer back some of the argumentation that was said. First, they say that China's economy will overpass us eventually, and that's why we should probably seek accommodation with Russia because of all these good things. However, we see that China is at their lowest ever in their economy. The coronavirus, the perception of the issue is causing their economy to be hurt. Yes, I'll get your first question.
I addressed this in response to your POI. The financial markets are exactly that, financial. They're not driven by real capital. I'm talking about actual economic output, not numbers floating on screens.
Yeah, I'll get onto that more later, why a lot of your stuff was just assertions. Furthermore, they said that we should probably talk with Russia because China is a threat. And they make a lot of these assertions that we offer Putin a deal, and he'll probably work with the United States so we can better protect us against China. However, logically, why wouldn't we seek accommodation with the bigger threat, even whenever the member of government comes up and states that Russia isn't a threat militarily to us right now? Furthermore, they stated that Russia and Putin would work with a deal because if we offer it, then eventually it will come to a good decision. However, they don't actually give us any idea. They want the PM to give them a full set out plan, but they say their accommodation, we don't know what it is, but it'll probably be good for the US and not as good as Russia. They need to be held up to the same standard of how and why Russia will change its ideology, no thank you, completely to accommodate to the US's wants and needs. Time and time again, the member of government tells you that the Russian Federation has not listened to the United States ideas. So suddenly we do more talks with their State Department, it would automatically do this. Yes, your second question.
Will you, even if you don't buy our logic point, will you engage with our diplomatic points on human rights abuses in China and on nuclear tensions?
Yes, that's actually on my substantive point of matter. I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
And finally, the main argumentation is that, like, why would we not accommodate China if they're the biggest threat? And they bring up Eastern Europe, but, like, we probably have, like, NATO to check back on Russia for Eastern Europe. Like, why would we not accommodate the person who's a bigger threat? But furthermore, let's get on to two substantive points of argumentation that we feel are, like, more important than just the set base standard of economics. We will talk about why seeking accommodation with China will be better for human rights abuses in China, and secondly, how it will restore election legitimacy within the United States. But first, and how this seeking accommodation with China will better, better human rights in China. We agree with the Prime Minister how China government has not have a good track record with human rights. We see furthermore, we see the people of Tibet, we see the Uyghur people of the Muslim minority in China being discriminated against simply because of what they believe in. We see many abuses continue to perpetuate against the LGBTQ community. This form of dehumanization is unnecessary and it's very tragic. So we should seek accommodation with China over Russia to use whatever soft power and influence we have in the region to help reform these issues.
On this.
No, thank you. Whenever we talk about human rights, there is no reason to completely ignore these human rights abuses in China. We see that sanctions of the Russian government, why it didn't completely fix, no thank you, why we hadn't completely fixed the human rights abuses in Russia, it has made dividends. When we continue on this path, we can at least start to fix these human rights abuses in China and give the Uyghur people, the LGBTQ community, and the Tibetan people, I'm not saying it will fix the problem completely, but at least go in a first direction into fixing this dehumanization and making the lesser of these people. No, thank you. So, now that we discussed human rights, we must detect a different kind of path that you see uniquely from the second opposition, that is election legitimacy. We see that when we seek accommodation with Russia over China, we see that the perception of President Trump working with Russia hurts the legitimacy for a couple of reasons. Whether or not people say the Russian hacking exists, or you always see memes on the internet how like Putin and Trump are in bed together or whatever. We see that whenever we seek accommodation to Russia at the expense with our relationship with China, it only legitimizes this issue. In 2016, with the Russian hacking, the Electoral College, no thank you, we see that the election legitimacy was decked in the United States. We saw people have more faith in 2018, but whenever we see that the Putin-Trump relationship is low, but then Trump completely abandons, even have these talks.
Last chance.
Like, no thank you, like the member of government discusses. Even if the State Department engages in these talks, it will legitimize this perception, and we'll see less political efficacy. We'll see less voting. We will see less people actually involving themselves in the political atmosphere because they believe that nothing matters, that their vote doesn't matter. You see that there will be less fights against the structural racism, the income inequality, the gender inequality within the United States if people believe that their voice doesn't matter. If we see the United States completely abandon their initiatives with China and seek accommodation with Russia more, which the resolution calls for, it would only legitimize this idea and make the political efficacy and make the people's will to fix these inequalities worse. So essentially, what have I told you today? We told you that the member of government makes a lot of broad assumptions, and they say that they don't really know what accommodation means in this instance, but it's probably beneficial for the United States. We see that if we seek accommodation with the China over Russia, and we do not completely abandon our initiatives, we see that we can actually make real, not economic, but real people and structural change in terms of human rights abuses within China. And we can restore election legitimacy in the United States to give people a hope and a reason to continue that fight.
That was Manny Reyes speaking as the leader of closing opposition. We will now turn it over to Tara Jones from Dundee to serve as the government whip and close side government bench's case.
I'm sorry, I'll be a couple seconds to organise my notes.
so I'd again like to thank everyone here today. Like, we really appreciate it. We love to host you. Can't do it too long on that because I need to do a speech. So, like, rebuttal. So, like, China will be a threat because they are the superior economy, and they will, like, they allow control of the South China Seas, and because of the oil, like, this allows them to field a balloon water navy, which is very difficult. Like, this is, yeah, that. Okay, so, right, why we went, I'm going to do 3 things in this debate. I'm going to talk about why we went over OO, I'm going to talk about why we went over CO, and I'm going to talk about why we went over OG. So, OO. So, this whole thing, like, this, like, blah, blah, blah. Right, so this whole thing, first of them, like, this little sidetrack, like, Joe talks about, like, sanctions and treaties and blocking, like, these will be helpful, but, like, all 3 of these people, like, so China, Russia, and the US are all on the UN Permanent Security Council, so things like treaties and sanctions, like, aren't going to be affected because any of them can still veto, like, that doesn't affect anything. Talking about relationships breaking down. So the reason that we keep Russia on our side, and this is very important, is because what Russia wants right now, as James has characterised, so we think that what Russia cares about is, like, opportunity-driven and transactional. They have interests in the Middle East, but what are these interests? These interests are water points. These interests are, like, stable, friendly regimes. And what the US can provide to Russia that will keep them on side, as James said, was, like withdrawing things in Syria by having these water points. So these are things that, like, we can keep Russia on our side, like, and keep them satisfied. So, like, this is within our interest because as the US, we want to keep relations in the Middle East. We want to keep our presence there. This is important of us. So, like, also this whole idea of the US has to squash China to seek accommodation of Russia. Like, we just don't believe this is true. Like, also, even if it was, like, US at the moment can't squash China, like, as James has said, and this is why it is important that we align with Russia opposed to China. Like, we concede with them that the war is inevitable. So what we bring is vital. So why is this true? The US will crumple without the upkeep of its military, and this is vital, as James provided. I'm going to talk more about the military and how this is upkept by going with Russia. But first of all on that, so, like, why is this important? It's not in the US's interest to collapse. And at the point where a conflict is inevitable and China is going to be against Russia at some point, if the US does not have the military to go against China, then they're just ruined. Like, so why is this stop? So, like, what this does, and what's fundamentally important is this, is China is the boogeyman. China is the boogeyman that keeps the funding for the US's military. So, like, I'm going to talk about Rory now. So, like, Rory brings this idea that we need proxy wars for US military, and, like, it just doesn't work this way. So why is this true? Like, as James says, like, these things don't get any real training. Like, what we see their training look like, it doesn't come in, like, surface to ground or navy to ground, which is what would be important in, like, a war with China. So what we think is that proxy wars don't actually give the US training. This is important because this training doesn't occur. So the proxy wars aren't they don't matter to the US. So, but even if they did, like, these proxy wars were important, what James uniquely brings is this idea of a boogeyman. So, like, he analyses why this is true, and this is important for comparatives. So the US needs a boogeyman to grow its economy, to grow its military, and to justify to its constituents this huge military spending. Because the US spends a lot on its military, and this can't just be done for no reason. Like, we need a credible opposition for China to spend it on its military to defend itself against. And we do not think that Russia is this opposition at the moment because of the way that Russia and Russia and the US are already allied. We see this through Trump. I'm going to speak about that when I flash the second half of the debate. So, yeah. So what this is important, so, like, as the US, and we think this is the most impactful thing in the round, we want to keep US military spending up. We want to keep US's military spending strong in case of any examples of war, and the only way to do this is having China as a boogeyman. So, like, why do we care about this? So both sides admit that the military is essential, especially in opening half. So, like, this is the biggest impact in the debate, because if we don't align with Russia, what we're going to do is align with China. So this kind of brings in, like, CO into the argument. So if we align with China, we don't have this boogeyman to justify the spending, and this is important because if we cannot justify military spending will decrease. This means that there's an opportunity cost. It means at the point at the point where there would be a conflict, which James has analysed is inevitable, that we'd have to rebuild our military, and this creates an opportunity cost because if we can't rebuild, like, we need to rebuild our military opposed to just keeping it steady, so we lose money. So, like, what happens if we keep our military up? The war is, sure.
Yeah, you said that we need to keep China as the boogeyman to upgrade the United States the military spending, but, like, they've been upgrading the military spending for how many years without, like, a credible, like, enemies, so why do we need like China?
So I believe that the US has always had an enemy. Like this is like the case. Like China has been an enemy of the US previously. Yeah. So like, yeah. And the US has always had things. Like even if you go back before that, like Cold War, US arms race even before that. Yeah. Okay. So like going on to CO then, this whole thing, like, so facts don't matter in a debate. What matters in a debate is analysis, who proves the case, and why impacts matter. So like what I want to bring to this whole idea of the human rights argument is, why does America care what happens with human rights in China? Like they literally don't. And for this whole argument that, like, now I want to address the election legitimacy point and why we won on that. So Trump is president. Trump has allies with Putin. Trump throughout his campaign always endorsed Putin. He always said, yeah, he's a good friend, he's a good friend. So we just think that, like, because of the supporters he has, like, what do the supporters of Trump look like? They're alt-right, global, populists. And they don't care whether Trump is aligned with Russia or not. So, like, you just need to look at the impeachment to see that this is true. So, yeah, like, yeah, Trump is president, like, yeah. So, going on to OG. So what we think we bring is we bring like harms in this debate where we, like, I'm going to admit here, so we don't completely clash, but what we do, so what does it fall to when we don't completely clash then? It's analysis and impact. So what James uniquely analyses is the interests of all actors and why what will happen on our side of the motion will, so the analyses the interests of all actors and why this is important for our case. So what the US, and this includes what the US, China, Russia, and the rest of the world wants. So why is this important? It shows how the US benefits from this. Like, we're prepped for this inevitable war. It keeps Russia neutral in the Middle East. Like, if there was this inevitable war, because the US already has its military and it keeps its military on a solid level before it's starter, we need China to be the boogeyman and we win on like these clashes. So if the harms we bring in, okay. Like, if the war started, yeah, like, if the war is short, this is an inherent good because there's less life lost. We believe this happens through keeping military power government.
And we will now turn it over to Bobby Gums to close off side opposition's case over the resolution this House, as the United States, would seek accommodation with Russia in opposition to China.
Okay, we've heard a lot in today's debate, and I have a lot that I want to say, so I'm going to jump right in. First, we're going to hear some rebuttal based off of what the government whip just said, and then I'm going to give 3 unique questions for exactly why closing opposition as well as opening opposition are actually truly carrying today's debate. First, let's look towards the first argument that she brought up, and that is saying that China is a threat. Well, what we need to realize is that when I questioned this, the only response that we got was about floating numbers, and like, I don't like it, we might not like it, but those floating numbers matter when it comes to global legitimacy when you're actually analyzing the economic impact that China has as a whole. I was already able to prove that China is at the lowest economic impact that it's had in the last 10 years, and that is already going down because of the tariffs that the United States has planted on them, as well as the amount of trading partners that they're actually losing because people are afraid of catching the coronavirus, even though it's not actually as large as the media is trying to make it seem like, whatever. But what we need to realize is that if the United States wants to keep its economy at where it is at, and if China wants to better their economy, since they are interdependent with each other and mutual deficit partners, China is a better way to go than Russia. Thus, my second response is to when they were talking about how it's not in the U.S.'s, not yet, sorry, in the U.S.'s interest to collapse because Russia and China will inevitably have a war. What we need to realize is that Russia and China actually work together quite a lot. They strong-arm the United States together constantly. An example of this was the Venezuelan conflict from last year. This is a modern example of this happening. I'll get you in a second. I will get both of you at the end of this. Another thing that I want to look at is the fact that when we're actually looking towards today's resolution, all 3 of the countries involved are extremely strong countries that have a lot of influence over the world. This is something that we all need to realize. But today's resolution says that this House asked the U.S. would seek accommodation from Russia in opposition to China, and easily, China is the best option in the United States' interest. And I'll get to that more when I elaborate the relationship between Donald Trump and Putin and everything that my opponents have already stated. Yes, your first
I spent 2 minutes analyzing in extensive detail why China is an existential threat to the states. You cannot simply ignore this and say they didn't. Judges, look to your notes. It's
I
there.
won't. I have 3 questions to refute that. Okay, I believe opening had a question as well.
Will you engage with our diplomatic statement on the nuclear tensions in Russia and how it could lead to nuclear war?
Yeah, that's actually another one of my questions. So I'll finish my rebuttal and then I'll get to all 3 of those. The last thing that we need to realize, and this was, no, I have 2 more, sorry. One of the largest things that they talked about was the military. They're saying that making China the boogeyman does a lot. But what we need to realize is that this doesn't actually fix anything. They asked about an enemy, but I'm going to get to this more with my second question because there is an actual boogeyman in the room, and I promise you all, it's not China. The last part of rebuttal that I actually have is the argument that they had about Trump. What we need to realize is that, yes, our perception is that Trump definitely supports Russia. We've seen so many things about Trump and Putin together. It's a large global meme by this point. But what we need to realize is that our perception of the situation does not actually prove whatsoever that Russia is a better person for the United States to seek accommodations from. There's actually no legitimacy there. So let's move on to our 3 questions that we need to analyze today when we're actually looking at our flow for who won today's debate. First, we're going to analyze what does it mean to seek accommodation. Second, we will look at what does a US-Russia scenario actually look like versus a US-China. And lastly, we're going to ask ourselves, why China? First, what does it mean to seek accommodation? What we need to realize is that accommodations is seeking whatever you need to sustain your country. So whether you are exclusively looking at the lodging argument or the diplomacy argument, these don't necessarily have to be exclusive. It's fine, whatever you decide is best. At the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, what is more beneficial for this house as the United States? That is the question that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to accommodations. And we were easily able to prove as the opposition that China is a better way to go when it comes to benefiting the United States through accommodations. Second, what does a US-Russia scenario look like? As the government bench has already stated, Russia and China are kind of similarly ranked when it comes to human rights violations. That's something that none of us are trying to downplay because they're both awful. But however, China is significantly better. Both countries, as the DLO alluded to, have leaders that use the other country as a boogeyman. But what we need to realize is that you can completely apply my partner's election legitimacy argument here because a lot of American citizens, most American citizens, are not afraid of China. It can't be as easily placed on China as the boogeyman because we still have generations of Americans who literally, as children, had to go to school and duck and cover underneath their desks because they were terrified of Russia. We are still afraid of Russia in 2020. But you know what I was never afraid of and had to duck and cover for while I was in school growing up? China.
On this.
No, thank you. I took 2. Let's move on to our third and most important question of the day. Okay? What actually happens with China? Why China? We've heard a lot today about why Russia was better. They talked about nuclear war, they talked about human rights violations, and these are completely understandable arguments. They are legitimate, and I'm not going to downplay these whatsoever. But when we're actually talking about war, we need to realize that this action isn't actually probable because all 3 countries are large global economies, they are large influencers and global players to the point where they're not going to actually nuke one another because it's going to collapse the entire world, and nobody wants to collapse their regime that they've worked so hard on creating. That's important in today's debate. Why China? Well, we were able to prove that interdependence, especially on an economic level, is extremely important because China and the United States need each other on a level that I can't even explain. Capitalism is a large part of the United States, and we're not going to give up our relationship with China whatsoever. Second, government gave a riveting speech about the U.S. just wanting to sell its crap, and I completely agree. It was very charismatic. I put my pen down at one point because I believed you. You're right. But if that's actually true, the U.S. should seek accommodation with China because they have the machines to do this. They have the machinery. They have the economic benefits to actually move the U.S. economy where we need to be. Russia does not actually give us that, and that's really important in today's debate. Second, we need to look at election legitimacy, as my partner said. Elections in the United States are becoming a joke because of Trump's relationship with Russia. Trump's relationship with Putin is a global meme, as I already stated, and it's giving moving with China will give Americans more hope and more trust in elections because Russia, we are constantly in fear that they will hack our elections, therefore delegitimizing our elections and their legitimacy as a whole. Our system does not actually need help being problematic, so why are we going to give Russia another entrance in to do that? We were also able to see, as the leader of opposition said, that there's a lot of backlash. They talked about fragile relationships as well as economic benefits, and that's something that definitely needs to be looked at when it comes to today's flow. Lastly, talked about human rights, and this is extremely important because all 3 are full of human right violations. Nobody's trying to downplay that whatsoever. But the CO proved how China could benefit from, the CO was able to prove how China could benefit from a partnership with the United States because if you have a country that you're seeking accommodations with, you're going to want to play in favor of what they're going to find more favorable. It could actually benefit China to look towards the United States as sort of a role model since we are considered a world leader and superpower. So at the end of the debate today, you need to ask yourself, what side actually proved that it would be more beneficial to this House as the United States as the resolution states?
And that was Bobby Gums closing off side opposition's bench. and concluding today's debate. Now what happens is the adjudicators will step out of the room and they will start to discuss who they think won tonight's debate. And Jack and I are going to do a little bit of discussion, bringing you up to speed on some of what we saw tonight, because we did see some really unique elements to British parliamentary debate. So this is going to be a fantastic learning opportunity about a new debate that we don't get to see very often in the States. So, Jack, I have some questions for you that I was hoping you would help discuss and just bring some information to the table and help our viewers to know what's really happening. We hear a lot of reference to CG, CO, OO, and OG. Can you tell us what that means? Because we've heard the debaters in all three debates thus far referring to these CG, OG. What does all that mean?
It's just abbreviation. CG is closing government. OG is opening government. CO is closing opposition. OO is opening opposition. Debaters, because they want to say as much as possible, very often develop jargon or they develop acronyms, abbreviations, those kinds of things. They know what it means, but as an audience member, very often when you watch a debate, you're like, what? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like talking to somebody in the military or a policeman or, everybody, or a lawyer, a doctor. They all have their own jargon, and so it's just jargon.
Sure. Okay. Another piece of jargon that I think is important to explain to the viewers is when you hear speakers referring to Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker. What does that mean when people are giving their speech? Who is this Madam and Mr. Speaker they're talking to?
Well, the chief adjudicator in a world's format debate, usually there are 3 to 4 judges. The one that serves as the chief adjudicator functions much as the Speaker of the House in Congress. They control who speaks, they recognize the speakers, they thank speakers, and they basically keep the debate on track and moving in the direction that it's supposed to move in. And they just, they will, if it's a female chief adjudicator, they'll say Madam Speaker. If it's a male, they'll say Mr. Speaker. It's just a way of referring to, they're delivering their speech to, theoretically, the adjudication panel, but actually they're speaking to the audience,
Sure.
Because in British debate, it's very much audience-centered. And so they're trying to persuade an audience to side with them.
Sure. And that is one of the reasons that we absolutely love this format of debate, is it's a little bit more focused on big ideas, persuasive ideas, speaking to the audience in a way that just makes sense. So that's one of the things that we love about this format and why we value this trip so much, is it is a very different style than the debate that we get to do often in the States. Now, I have a couple other nuances to BP debate that I'd like you to help explain to our viewers. And this debate, like I said, was a fantastic example of some of the really fun parts of BP debate. So you got to see a little bit more of the wit and the humor and the sass that comes into this format of debate. Again, because it's so audience friendly, because we want to lure in as many people as we can and target the largest audience possible, you often see humor, you see a little bit of sass, a little bit of snark in there. So it's a fun way to just pull your audience in a little bit more. And I think this is probably the one where we've seen that the most thus far on this year's trip. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
When you obviously opening government, the prime minister takes the debate in a direction that they don't expect. Mm-hmm. When you take the word accommodate and you turn it into accommodations like hotel rooms and moving somewhere, I don't think the opposition really suspected that that's the direction that it would go. And so what it does is it one, it throws the opponent off to a certain extent, and she gets serious at the end when she starts talking about diplomacy, and she talks about human rights violations and those kinds of things. But by starting it out in sort of a whimsical way, it kind of opens the door then for other speakers. You've got one speaker that's, basically arguing, look, we need proxy wars. Proxy wars are important. Mm-hmm. How is she going to practice? How is she going to be dominant?
Right.
He's not serious.
Right.
He doesn't actually want proxy wars, but it's just a sort of a, you have to be able to sort between those arguments that are sarcastic and they're meant as sort of humorous pauses, and then the serious arguments that they really want the judges to focus on. I don't think you're going to have any judge voting on proxy wars.
Right.
But
probably not. And you bring up a really good point talking about this definition of accommodation. So if we would see something like that in Lincoln-Douglas debate or parliamentary debate, not British parliamentary, but parliamentary debate, what we usually do in the States, what we would probably see coming out of the opposition side then is what we would refer to as a topicality argument,
right,
which is where they question the definition and they advance a counter definition, basically saying what we saw out of opposition today, like, hey, this isn't what we prepared for. We only had 20 minutes of prep. You're kind of taking the debate in a strange direction and throwing a curveball, and that is a very, very serious point in BP. That's just kind of one of those rules that we follow, right? So while it was a bit of a squirrely definition, it did definitely take the debate in a different form, in a different way than opposition was expecting.
And the Prime Minister, as the government representative, the Prime Minister has the right to define the terms in the debate, so long as they're reasonable. And reasonable is a difficult word.
Right.
Who
defines reasonable?
Yeah, what is reasonable? So you've got the leader of the opposition sort of getting up and saying, "Hey, this isn't reasonable." When you're talking about the political or geopolitical sphere, you don't usually talk about hotel rooms. You don't usually talk about a mass exodus of people from one nation state to another. Usually you're talking about, political concessions to bring about treaties or that kind of thing. So it's not framed as a topicality argument, but really that's what it is.
Right. But
Yeah.
I will say, looking at accommodations, the arguments advanced did make some sense. So again, it's who's defining reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, another point that I want to bring up, linking to this whole squirreling of the definition, is what we saw coming out of closing government. This is a bold move that you see sometimes, and sometimes it pays off and it goes really well. Sometimes it is not looked upon favorably. It really depends on your adjudication panel, and it depends on who is defining reasonable in terms of that definitional debate that we've been talking about. And what we saw happening out of closing government was what we refer to in BP as knifing. Could you explain what knifing means, Jack?
Knifing is basically, and it can happen on the opposition as well.
Right, absolutely.
It's where the bottom half of the debate, either on the opposition or the government, basically distances themselves away from the opening opposition or opening government and says, yeah, we really think this is a bit unreasonable and we don't want to go with what they're saying, so we're going to take it in our own direction, so please don't associate. And there are good reasons to knife. If the opening prime minister, for example, says something that's terribly egregious, they make an argument that like euthanasia is perfectly acceptable, or people that are maybe a racial kind of case where they talk about inferior races or they denigrate women. Second, they don't want to be associated with that, and so they knife them and say, look, those guys are basically, going in a direction that we don't want to be identified with. We want to get it back on topic. We don't want to say things that might be offensive. So there are good reasons to do it. And, sometimes you just, you do it because you just want to take the debate in a different direction.
Sure.
It's not what you prepared for. And so in order to get done what you want to do, you knife, just so you can take it, don't pay any attention to them. Let's go talk about this.
Right.
And here I think, the humor was used in the beginning, and they kind of thought, not that funny to us because we wanted to take it a different direction. So they knifed.
Sure.
It's always humorous to see.
Yes. Yeah. And real moment here, and this is probably my nerdy teacher heart. I wasn't really looking forward to this resolution.
What?
What? I know. It didn't really excite me very much.
Yeah.
But I will say this has been one of my favorite debates because we've gotten to talk about all of these little sorts of nitty-gritty stylistic components, and we've totally turned it into a teachable moment. So I know.
What a geek.
I know, a little bit, but it's been really fun. One other question that I want to ask you before we bring in one of their students to chat with me is one of the strategies that we saw in the government whip speech. So obviously in BP debate, you are trying to make sure that your team is seen as getting the one or the superior team in the debate. And you saw a very interesting and a very clear-cut strategy coming out of her speech where she just flat out said, here are the 3 reasons we win, and I'm going to break it down by why we win over opening op, why we win over closing, and why we win. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, that's the job of the whip. The whip wants to convince the adjudication panel that they're the top team in the debate. Usually, you don't see them going after all 3 teams necessarily. You'll see them go after the opposing sides, right? But in this case, because they had knifed the opening, they had to go after them as well. So they went after all 3 in this case. And that's a direct result of the knife.
Okay. It was a fun and interesting strategy. Again, a great learning opportunity for all of us and for everybody watching at home. So we are going to bring in one of Dundee's students, Roxana Pollock, who is their equity officer for the society, to come and chat with us a little bit. So Jack's going to step off for a minute. Roxana's going to get set in. And we have about 5 minutes remaining. So Roxana, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And chatting. So equity officer, that is a really fascinating and fantastic position. Could you just tell us a little bit about your role in the society?
Well, basically, I suppose it's similar to most equity officer positions. Since debates tend to get kind of heated at times, you need to make sure that people are feeling comfortable and that no one is feeling attacked by anyone. So if there's any kind of issue, people usually come to me, and then I'm a mediator in those conflicts.
Interesting. So does that happen during the debate, or does that happen after?
No,
the
it's
debate?
usually after. Yeah, everything is very confidential, so
Sure.
I would never disclose anything that people don't want.
Right. Okay. So what sort of proactive measures do you put in place to ensure that nothing like that happens?
Well, basically, one of the main things is that before public debates, which we have every week, and they're like our main source of attention, we make sure that we state before the debate starts that the opinions aren't our own, that people tend to make generalizations so that people in the audience are prepared for what's coming. If it's a very sensible topic, that we prepare the audience in terms of like making them aware that they can step out at any point, and that if they afterwards have any questions or if there's any issue, that they can approach me or anyone else who's on committee.
Okay, that's awesome. Now, is this a role that has been around a long time, or have you
Yes.
seen? Okay.
It's in the Scottish Debating Union. It's a very well-established role, and for competitions, for example, the equity officers are very important because they usually take the role of making sure that all the people who are competing are comfortable and that the pronoun policy is taken into account, that everyone has someone to go to if they, for example, can't participate in the debate, because sometimes there are sensible topics and you're allowed to step out for 2 rounds during a competition here, and you can still break. So in that case, you would go to your equity officer and be like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this because I've had experiences with whatever, and then they can account for that. And they usually also take care of accommodation, those kind of things, so that just things are set in place. So they're very important as like a background character.
I love that. We are starting to see more of this in the United States and other formats of debate as well. This is a position that I am a part of with our National Forensics Association. So it's so great to see that this is like a long-standing tradition here. We need to take more notes from you, I think. But it looks to me like they are ready for us in the chamber already. Well, I wish we would have been able to chat longer. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more about what you do, but maybe we'll catch up after the debate.
Hopefully.
But let's turn it back over into the chamber so we can hear the adjudicator's decision.
Largely through their wit, but also through the member of opposition,